This is Lois Whealey for Women Today and Yesterday. I have a potpourri, you might say, today of various things I'm going to be talking about. We're right in the middle of Black History Month, of course, and coming up soon in March will be Women's History Month. Two areas that I've had a long interest in. The event that I want to particularly mention is coming up in about a month's time, and that will be the annual celebration of International Women's Day Festival, which we've had at Ohio University now for about 8 years, I believe. So it will be this year on March 19th, which is a Sunday. It's always on a Sunday afternoon at Baker Center Ballroom. And so the 19th is the date that you should mark on your calendar for International Women's Day Festival. Actually, the International Women's Day is traditionally on March 8th. That's been the case for more than 100 years. When International Women's Day was first celebrated in Europe, I think in Germany actually, and by a socialist group of women. But it's expanded over the years. Now it's International Women's Day around the world. And so celebrating it during International Women's Day Festival during March is a very good time to do it. The reason that it's not right around March 8th itself, the traditional day, has to do with the university calendar and the way they set things up at the university. We want to be sure to avoid the spring vacation break because that's a time when, of course, a lot of students take off, hopefully for warmer climes. Many go to beaches in Florida and otherwhere in the South where they might be able to get away from the cold blasts of winter, which we are currently experiencing here in Athens. Although compared to some other places in the country, you might say that we're pretty much in luck. We're just having kind of cold weather, whereas in New York City, in Brooklyn actually, where my daughter and granddaughters are living currently, they had the very unique experience of having a day of summer when the temperature was in the 60s, and the very next day, a blizzard, northeaster, blew in from the Atlantic and brought 14 inches of snow. So that is really weird weather. And I want to mention another odd weather freak of the year. After about 5 years of terrible drought out west, which is, you know, where I hail from originally, from the state of Nevada, they've had a drought, especially in California, for like 5 years until all of a sudden, here comes 2016-17 winter, and they are having record-breaking rains and snows. Snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains, where my brother lives on Route 50 out in Fallon, Nevada. The reservoir there that provides irrigation water had sunk lower and lower, and last year they were only able to have about 2 cuttings of alfalfa, which is unusual. Usually they get 3, but it was so dry that there was water rationing and they didn't have the correct amount of water to raise alfalfa, because the reservoir was practically down to nothing. However, this year it is now brimming with water from both rain, some rain in Nevada itself, which is pretty rare, but also the snow melt from the Sierra Nevada mountains and the rains that they've had in California. So much so that there has been a terrible threat. I guess it's perhaps lightening up a bit now, but there's a huge dam in Oroville on the Feather River in California. And actually, Rachel Maddow pointed out on her show last week that this was a pretty chancy situation. The reservoir was filled, and the rains kept coming, and they had to use an emergency spillway. Turned out the emergency spillway had a big underground hole in it and wasn't working properly, and there was real threat for a while, and it still might occur, that there'd be this terrible flood down the Feather River and the Sacramento River in California because of tremendous rains that they've had, with more coming, they say. So, and you know how it is, what an average is. If you have a drought one year and a flood the next year, if you balance the two out, hey, you got 2 average years. And of course, that's not the way that we actually live. Well, today I want to talk more about the International Women's Year meeting that was held 40 years ago this year on June 11th and 12th of 1977. I remember that time quite well, since I served on the state committee that planned the IWY meeting, and have later written that account up of what happened at our planning meetings and pre-planning meetings and so on, and have shown you on the air the 1976 book, which set up the women's meetings, called To Form a More Perfect Union, with the, you see in the corner there, the symbol of the women, with the equality sign as the tail feathers and the women's sign, a circle with a cross below it, as the neck piece of the bird there. To form a more perfect union. Justice for American Women was the subtitle. And that came out in 1976, following up International Women's Year, the very first one by the United Nations, held in Mexico City in 1975. And the idea was to have a follow-up in every state and territory in the U.S. So they were having, around the world, they were having follow-ups to International Women's Year, the first one celebrated by the United Nations. And it became quite an interesting event. We had meetings, state meetings, in every state and territory of the United States, which meant 56 state meetings and territorial meetings. And I mentioned in an earlier program that I did about the key role that our Congressman, Clarence E. Miller, played in trying to prevent any money being spent for any of these 56 meetings. However, finally, and despite his best efforts to stop payment for these meetings, they were scheduled to be held in the year 1977, and $5 million was allocated to have 56 meetings around the country, including, of course, Ohio. So that was quite an event here in the state of Ohio, as I mentioned earlier, and I wrote an essay and memoir about that, from which I read the last time. I'm not sure I can read this as carefully as I might want to, but do let me give you some background on that. The chair of the Ohio meeting was Mary E. Miller of Columbus, a woman originally from Portsmouth in southern Ohio, of course, and she had been active in Columbus, where she was living at the time. By the time they were having these state meetings, she was in Columbus on a permanent basis, and she had become the chair of the coalition which pressed Ohio to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment being passed in 1971 by Congress, and then going to the states for ratification, with Ohio becoming the 33rd or perhaps 34th state to ratify, and it was practically the very last one, which is why there is no Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution today, although from time to time proponents seek to have it put before the voters in a few more states. 38 are needed for passage, and only 35 have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So there still is some hope for it, perhaps, but we'll have to see. January of 1977 was nearly over, and Indiana became the 35th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, although it had been turned down by Virginia, the state of Virginia. And I was in touch with Mary E. Miller in Columbus. She had said that she had recommended me for that committee, the planning committee for International Women's Day, days actually, because they were set up in Ohio for June 11th and 12th, 1977, at the state fairgrounds. And she did write me early in February saying she assumed I'd received a letter inviting me to serve on the committee. And the first meeting was actually going to be held on the 18th of February. Well, that's practically an anniversary time now, since we are, I believe, at the 17th today. So that would be exactly 40 years ago that this first state committee was convened in Columbus to plan for the state meeting. Also named from Athens was a young board member of Woven, a group, a coalition of women's groups that Mary E. Miller chaired. And the other person from Athens was Susan Kreitz Frampton, currently Susan Price, living in Washington, D.C. And in those days, she was a recent graduate of Ohio University, who was president of Athens Now chapter and a news writer at the Ohio University Public Information Office. So she and I went to Columbus on February 18th, 1977, and that was the first of about half a dozen trips to Columbus for the Ohio IWY Coordinating Committee. And that was quite an eye-opening experience for me because, of course, here we had over 40 women from around the state of Ohio. Many of them were not familiar with each other. We were from different parts of the state and active in different women's groups and so on. So there we all were with our own particular agendas, you might say, things that we would like to see happen at the International Women's Day meeting in June. And people were so strong-minded with this several dozen women from different parts of the state. I wondered whether we would be able to work together. Well, of course, it worked out quite well in terms of our committees getting together. And one of the things that was decided was to have an outreach committee. I remember especially the outreach committee because I chaired it. And I think they named me to that committee because I had pointed out that although most women in Ohio live in either cities or suburbs, there are a lot of rural people too, or people from less populated parts of the state. And of course, coming from Athens, that included me. So, as outreach committee chair, I, of course, my first job was to make up a press release to send out to women's groups and to newspapers about the fact that at our first meeting on February 18th, 1977, we had decided on the time and place, namely June 11th and 12th at the State Fairgrounds in Columbus. And Susan Frampton, as she was then, got our message out to the news outlets that she was in touch with. So we were underway, for sure, and Mary Miller let Susan and me know that the Columbus Dispatch had printed a nice copy of the announcement about the upcoming meeting, which of course was several months away then. And in March, we met at least twice on the 12th and the 24th. Now, 1977 turned out to be a very, very busy year for me. And it was the case that between the two March meetings of the International Women's Year Coordinating Committee, I was actually away in New York City being trained to help conduct a survey of the attitudes of Ohio people toward the United Nations. And I did that for the League of Women Voters of Ohio, who had received a grant from the United Nations to conduct this survey. It was also conducted in a couple of other states around the country. And my job, as it turned out, was to hold focus groups. I'm not sure we even called them that in that day, but we had little groups of some people who had agreed to come together in Dayton, in Columbus, and in Youngstown to talk about their views on the United Nations. My own interest in the United Nations dates back to 1945, when I was an 8th grader in Fallon, Nevada, and they were writing the Charter of the United Nations in San Francisco at that time. Of course, that Second World War was still on then, because VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, didn't occur until May 8th. So when they began writing the Charter of the United Nations, which had been promoted by Franklin D. Roosevelt, our president, who had tragically died in April, and he was a rather young man. Seems young to me now at my age, of course, 84, but he was still in his late 50s when he died in Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12th, 1945. A day which I remember well because we were called to an immediate an emergency session at our school out there in Nevada. It would have been in the afternoon there, and received word that the president had passed away. That's something you always remember, like the people who recall what they were doing when they heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. You know, these key times of tragedy, especially in America, like 9/11, 2001. People remember what they were doing when they heard about the Twin Towers in New York City being hit by planes and falling down. Well, that was the kind of thing that one remembers as a child. But back to Ohio and the International Women's Year meeting and the United Nations. I did hold those 3 focus groups around Ohio in the middle of March 1977. And actually, one of the things that I particularly remember about that was the woman in Dayton who she remembered that the Korean War had been called as a police action by the United Nations in 1951, you know, in reaction to the Korean in 1950-51, in reaction to the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. The United Nations response, with particularly American servicemen going to Korea and chasing the North Koreans back up to their part of the Korean peninsula. And so that was an event which again was remembered mostly, but she remembered it in particular because her husband had been in the service at the time and had been sent to Korea and was away for a year. And she always blamed the United Nations for that police action, which sent her husband, who came back safely, thank heaven, away in 1951. Well, there were challenges to the outreach for International Women's Year, for sure. And we needed more than PR releases, obviously. What else could we do? Well, there were talks. One of the members of our committee was State Senator Mary Jean Valaket of Toledo, I recall. And she was a speaker in Marietta that spring and spoke about the upcoming International Women's Year meeting at that Marietta conference. And there was also a member of the committee who was president of the Business and Professional Women of Ohio at the time, and who had been active actually in the publication of To Form a More Perfect Union, because she had been working in Washington, D.C. for the BPW at the time. And she spoke actually right here in Athens in April at a annual meeting that was held of the American Association of University Women of Ohio. I think that was the only time that we ever had a state meeting of AAUW right here in Athens, but that was in the spring of 1977. So, what could we do to bring people in? I mean, it's one thing to get the word out, and then you have to actually make sure that you can get women to come to a conference. And what about the poorer women or people from rural areas or distant parts, even though Columbus is a very handy place, being so centrally located as it is in the state. But we needed to get word out. We had a little money. Remember that money that we got in spite of Clarence Miller? We had some money for buses, and buses were arranged for in different parts of the state to bring people to the state meeting. One of the people who was quite active in that was Suzanne Hughes from Uniontown in Northeast Ohio, a very active woman in many different groups. But I think she was also active in the Eagle Forum and Phyllis Schlafly's group, Eagle Forum, or perhaps it was Ohio Right to Life, which was headquartered then, as I think perhaps it still is, in Cincinnati, Ohio. And she made sure that people, women around the state, not only in the Northeast, but also in the Cincinnati area, were aware that there were buses that could be chartered to bring people to the fairgrounds in June. And many of them came from those particular right-wing organizations. Another person who was quite active was Mary G. Ganded from Dayton, who was also quite active in various groups, but also, I believe, in Eagle Forum. So anyway, the outreach was pretty well observed, I'd say, after all. And we had a state meeting of presidents of women's groups. I think there were more than a dozen of those women who came to Columbus for a luncheon in April of 1977. I do have a nice picture that was in the Columbus Dispatch that showed me and Mary Miller, our chairman, and also a black lady from Youngstown. So that's a nice memento of that time, and the fact that we had an article, again, in the Columbus Dispatch, along with his picture, an article promoting the June meeting of International Women's Year, Ohio. So there was, actually, we had several regional meetings, and I think those were useful in getting people to come to the state meeting. There was one indefinitely in Cleveland, and there was also one in Cincinnati. So there were regional meetings as well in the spring of 1977. We also printed 150,000 bright yellow little announcements about the meeting, which were mailed to libraries, especially to libraries, and batches of them to some of the women's groups that were on our list for outreach. And we had many posters by May. So those went to about 1,000 Ohio libraries. We also had speakers' kits, and members of the coordinating committee did go to some of the spring meetings of other groups other than the ones that I have mentioned. There were also some participation grants for women to come, a little travel money, you know, maybe some gas money, and there were something like 300 beds reserved at the fairgrounds, where they have some accommodations, you know, especially for the 4-H boys and girls who come to the state fairgrounds for their meetings often. And that paid for a night's stay, since it was a 2-day meeting, for about 300 women who could apply for this small grant to help them with their expenses. Because that's part of the problem, you know, especially with rural people or poor people, either in rural or urban areas, to make sure that they have an opportunity to spend a night if they're going to a statewide meeting where you have to stay overnight. Then we had a very nice little newspaper type of thing, and I think that was particularly, in fact, ours was, we were so proud of it that we sent it to the National, and they had copies at the National meeting of our Ohio newspaper, which was printed up in Cleveland, actually. One of our members on the planning committee, Deanne Character of Shaker Heights, and was able to help with that particular project. 60 organizations were contacted by May 13th, inviting people to the meeting, and of course these were basically women's groups of all sorts. And then, like I mentioned, this newspaper that listed Worlds of Ohio Women, that's what we called it. And the report, actually, which came out after the meeting, was called that, The Worlds of Ohio Women, because we set up 18 workshop areas, planned for 18 workshop areas, and then there were some that were organized right at the meeting itself, and as well as in advance, in order to be sure that we could contact women in a number of different groups and areas. But there were all these workshops, and they were finally written up afterwards, of course, but it included things like the 56 women and 5 alternates that were elected at the state meeting to go to the national meeting in Houston, and a list of these people who were, it was a very interesting election, let's put it that way, because they had not only 56 on a slate that had been drawn up by the committee, but they also had groups that presented their own slates. Both Ohio Right to Life and Eagle Forum were well organized and had complete slates of people that they wanted to nominate to go to the Houston meeting. And it was well, there were some questions, is this really getting out to the grassroots, and especially to the conservative people? There were some conservative women who were quite concerned about this, and they were a little unhappy with how late letters got out to some of the groups. One particular person, I think it was Right to Life, sent copies of this letter to the congressmen, mostly Republican congressmen, who were not that much in favor of the meeting in the first place. Not only Congressman Miller, but a number of others. And finally the day came, the big day came, and the Worlds of Ohio Women meeting began on the 11th of June. That's when they had these 18 workshops and the election. And the election lines were long. First, they had to have the voting for the delegates. That was sort of the first order of business, was to make sure that there were some women going to Houston in November. And here was a quote, official list of a variety of women who were nominated. Then these other groups had their lists, and eventually there were 161 additional nominations. Now, if you can imagine, 161 plus 56, that's well over 200 names, and how on earth could people vote? Most people wound up just voting for the folks that they knew, or the folks who had been sponsored and endorsed by some group or other. Now, National Organization for Women also had a group of nominees, but that was rather short. They concentrated on about 20 names, and of those 20 names, some 11 were actually elected. They were the, quote, liberal women, mostly from the original list, actually. And they did go, and 45 delegates were elected from the groups of the Eagle Forum, Phyllis Schlafly's group, and Right to Life Ohio for the other 45. They even had buttons for the 11. That was a particular program or project to have buttons for that was one of the women who was endorsed and was a member of that small liberal group, had this idea, and I wonder where those buttons are now. I wonder if Susan Price still has her button, because she was one of the nominees from the group that was elected and did go to Houston. And when she got back after, it was held just before Thanksgiving in November of 1977 in Houston. And when she got back, she had a beautiful spread in the Athens Messenger report that she drew up, Susan Frampton Price, of the goings-on in Houston. One of the very nice things was that a member of the Ohio delegation, Anne Saunier from New Albany, had done such a good job at the June meeting with this tumultuous meeting, with all these people nominating 161 people, plus these 18 different workshops in 3 different buildings at the state state fairgrounds, that it was, she did such a good job, as I say, that she was chosen to chair one of the meetings in Houston. In fact, Anne Saunier chaired the largest meeting held at Houston, because she was a very calm and well-organized and well-collected person who was able to manage a large meeting and give people a chance to speak, keep up with parliamentary procedure and all that. She's only recently passed away, Anne Saunier of the Franklin County, actually. So, but as I mentioned, that was a very big year for me, in addition to the IWY meeting in Columbus and the holding those focus groups about the United Nations for the League of Women Voters. I also proposed a humanities conference, which was held and was scheduled for August of 1977. I think we have a copy of the poster from that meeting. There it is. Women's Place, Pride and Prejudice. This was something which I had organized, was working on organizing before I knew about these other events, actually. Of course, you have to make up, if you're going to have like a humanities conference, you have to have all the people in place who will be the speakers and so on, and get permission and sponsorship from the State Humanities Council, which I had been working on in February of 1977, and it did come to pass, Pride and Prejudice. And I called it a humanistic prelude to the National Women's Conference, to be held in Athens, Ohio, as it states right on the poster there. And I tried to get a number of delegates to come, the elected delegates. I at least contacted all those people in June, sent them a brochure about the Pride and Prejudice Conference and so on. And actually, at least 3 were there. 2 were women who were from Ohio Right to Life. One was Mary D. Miller of Zanesville, and that was quite interesting. She was elected to go to Houston, and Mary E. Miller, who chaired the June conference, was not elected. I think there might have been some confusion there about the names too, but Mary D. Miller came to my meeting, which was very nice, and also Connie Letta from Akron. And of course, Susan Frampton was on the spot, since she lived right here in Athens, and so we did have 3 people, 3 women who were actually going to Houston at my conference in August of 1977. Pride and Prejudice, of course, you know that's a famous book, probably the best well-known novel written by Jane Austen, the famous English author of the early 19th century. And but the words Pride and Prejudice, I think, can sum up in a way the way that women feel and the way women are sometimes treated, either with pride or sometimes with prejudice, especially by some of the more well, what should I call them? The more, the men who are the most set on masculine ways, who are not too fond of women, or perhaps don't value women as much as we might like. So, and Pride and Prejudice was interesting for the fact that we had at the time in Athens an actress who actually served on the city council. Her name is escaping me right now, and she moved away long ago. But she was a specialist in portraying Elizabeth Darcy, the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's book. And she gave a reading during our conference. She gave a special event in which she portrayed Elizabeth Darcy and some of the other heroines that Jane Austen promoted at our Pride and Prejudice conference in August of 1977. That was also the year that my oldest son graduated from high school. So that was a pretty big event, and he was one of the speakers. So of course we were in the audience, and we were astounded to hear him sing. In fact, everyone was astounded to hear him sing. And what did he sing? He sang a song that was popular at that time that was a kind of a sniffy song called Little Boxes. You know, how people live in little boxes on the hillside, and it was basically about being, you know, getting along and going along with the crowd. Little Boxes. And then later in the summer, he got his Eagle Scout Award. And then he went off to college at the University of Michigan in September of 1977. So that was another big event of that year. And finally, my husband got a word that he was going to have a federal grant to go to Spain to do research. And he left at Thanksgiving time of 77. So, like I say, it was quite a busy year for the Whealey family, even above and beyond the International Women's Year event that we had in June that I was a member of. One of the things I did immediately after the conference was over was to draw up a memo. You know, there were 14 conferences that were all held nationwide. 14 of the state conferences were held nationwide on that same weekend, but those were early conferences. There had been a few in May, but then there were 14 more on June 11th and 12th. And so I drew up a memo about points to ponder if you're going to be having a state meeting. And I think that these points to ponder can be used beyond 1977 for the most part. I'll read a couple of them. One is, if you're having a statewide meeting or a large meeting of any kind, you want to be sure to get a number of members there. You can't just have the presidents of groups, you know, as if it's really a statewide meeting, it needs to be broader than just the presidents of well-known groups. And then if there's a slate of people to vote on, as there was in 1977, you want to look at the official slate. Those are people who have been chosen, hopefully, broadly and for good reason and so on. Or if beyond the official slate, if you belong to an organization that does want to promote its members to be members of anything elected to go to a national meeting. You would certainly want to publicize your slate of people that you endorse or that you know would make good delegates. So that's another important point. And try to avoid nominating dozens and dozens of people from the floor, because that makes this bedsheet ballot that is almost impossible to deal with. For instance, at that June meeting, it was Susan was up all night because she was on the counting committee that had to, and it took them until practically the closing time on Sunday afternoon to make sure they had counted all the ballots fairly and had identified the 56 people who were to go to Houston. So you want to avoid a bedsheet ballot if at all possible, certainly. And be sure to watch the voting procedure. There were some people who it was alleged had voted once and then sort of stood in line again, which made it harder for the people who were waiting to get to vote this huge bedsheet ballot in the first place. And so you want to make sure that those folks don't come back and try to hold up proceedings more than they're already just being held up. So you've got to watch that voting procedure. And then another thing is, if you're having more than one day meeting, you want to make sure that your friends come back the second day. One of the interesting things about the June meeting that we had in '77 was that election day being June 11th, a number of people were bussed in who got back on the buses and went home that night, and they weren't there for the second day. Well, it was on the second day that they had a straw poll of women's issues, and a lot of those people who had voted for the conservative group were not there on the second day, and every single one of those, for the most part, pretty liberal stands on women's issues passed 2-1, because the people who were seriously interested in the business of the meeting, the 2-day meeting, stayed overnight or came back the next day from, visiting with friends, or perhaps they were in that subsidized housing that I mentioned had been set up arranged for at the fairgrounds. So, if it's a 2-day meeting, make sure that your friends come back the second day. And then, of course, it's very important to keep your cool and be polite, and certainly in spite of the fact that there were very strong feelings expressed in the various workshops and so on, there was politeness reigned. Of course, we like to think that women are like that anyhow. When we had that recent Women's March on January 21st, people commented at how well everyone acted. There weren't any particular protests, even in Washington, D.C., where people were absolutely packed in shoulder to shoulder, and couldn't march because they couldn't move. There were so many of them. There were about 1 million people out there filling not only the mall, but up to the Nation and up to the Washington Monument, but also nearby streets that they couldn't even move and march. But people were thoughtful, and there weren't any big outbreaks of impoliteness, despite there were people with very strong feelings on all sides, perhaps, of women's issues. So keeping your cool is very important. And don't let anyone make the meeting a one-issue meeting, which of course was sort of what happened to us. There were, for instance, a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment, which I think came out 154, or pardon me, 150 against on 141 for, something like that, you know, very, very close. So these things do happen. And you should be sure, too, that you participate and listen and hear what other people think and consider it, and just educate yourself. That's one of the very important things that can be done in a big meeting, if you ever attend one. So I do want to say once again that it was quite a year, that year 1977, for Lois Whealey, and for her family, and for the state of Ohio, and nationally for the women's meetings that were held in every state and territory, 56 of them, and finally in Houston in November 1977. And here we are in February 2017, 40 years further on, and this is Lois Whealey for women today and yesterday.